The job of the blender is to combine these elements in such a way as to produce an overall flavour.
A wider repertoire of different beverages than ever before.
I think one of the most interesting breweries, and certainly one of the most interesting origin stories for a brewery in Australia.
Single malts, blends, grain whiskies, bourbons and more.
If you want mezcal to be sold around the world, then unfortunately you're going to have to make a compromise.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Spearhead is a new whisky from the renowned Highlands Single Malt distillery, Loch Lomond, that shakes up Scotch whisky in numerous respects. For starters, it's a single grain whisky. That doesn't mean it's been distilled from wheat or corn or rye. Spearhead is made from malted barley using a continuous coffee-style still, also known as a column still. Now that's what makes it a single grain Scotch whisky, and the process enabled Loch Lomond to create a lighter style of spirit that would then undergo a unique maturation process that includes finishing in infrared toasted virgin American oak barrels. Loch Lomond is currently the only distillery in Scotland to use infrared barrels to finish whisky, and there's a raft of other innovative production tweaks that all combine to give Spearhead a sweeter taste profile, albeit with depth and complexity, that is designed to appeal to newer whisky drinkers or people who enjoy long drinks like highballs. This is a special episode of the Drinks Adventures podcast, produced with the support of Spearhead Whisky. You're about to meet Loch Lomond Master Blender Michael Henry and Head of Innovation Callum Leslie, who are going to tell you all about this exciting and unique whisky. And I started this interview by asking Callum why Loch Lomond had embarked on this project that resulted in the creation of an entirely new brand.
I guess from a Loch Lomond point of view, Michael's always been looking at innovation and what we can do differently. I think one of the gaps in the portfolio was maybe that kind of entry-level Scotch whisky that appealed to people who were trying to get into Scotch and often sort of younger consumers. So we looked at what younger consumers were drinking when it comes to whisky, and a lot of the time it was coming up as Irish whisky or American whisky, typically bourbon. Irish maybe because it was a little bit lighter, and American or bourbon because it's a bit sweeter. I think it was around about 8.1% of growth in American whisky occurred in the previous year. Looking at rye alone, it was 778%, and it was sort of similar for Irish whisky. So looking at the assets that we had available at the distillery, from our kind of continuous style still to the way that we mature and then finish the whisky, we really set out to produce a whisky that was lighter and sweeter, and then, by nature, a little bit more mixable than your typical Scotch whisky.
Yeah, and so maybe for people, who aren't super familiar with Loch Lomond, how would you say that Loch Lomond is known in the world of Scotch, stylistically?
Yeah, so when it comes to our signature distillery character, we focus on creating flavour at the start of the process. So we look at creating flavour through distillation rather than the wood character. We've two different types of pot stills, and by running the stills in different ways and using different levels of peat in the malted barley, we can create a huge range of flavour in the distillery itself. And then we mature in American oak, which gives a supporting background character. So we're able to get our kind of signature kind of fruit, honey, soft smoke character, mainly from how we distill, which is very different to the normal approach of Scotch whisky distillers, where wood and age are used significantly to kind of create different flavour expressions.
And in terms of creating a product that was going to appeal to those demographics that you talked about, Callum, you felt it was something that you couldn't do with single malt? I mean, through triple distillation or whatever it was?
I guess we kind of went down the single grain route because I think grain's the sort of last untapped true category for innovation in Scotch whisky. If you look at, single malt, there's been a ton of stuff that's done, blended and blended malt. Blended malt is now, super active. Whereas if you look at single grain, it's that kind of last untapped category where it gives you that huge level of starting to play around with, types of grains that are in the mash bill, all the way through to what you can do stylistically with the whiskey. So for a brand like Spearhead, it just seemed right for us to be able to focus on that area and continue to build that out over time.
Tell me where you went from there, Michael, with conceiving the recipe and the production methodology.
Having a standalone brand allows you really to create something that's flavour-led, and you're not kind of tied to any kind of character preconceptions about the distillery itself. So it really gives us an open book when it comes to the flavour. By using malted barley as the starting point for this expression, when we distill malted barley in a continuous still, we get a much richer spirit than you would compared to conventional Scotch single grain made with wheat or maize. So that really gives a rich flavour and a texture to the whiskey. There's more weight to it, as your starting point. And then with the column distillation, our column still is unique in Scotland in that it's made entirely out of copper, and we can take the spirit off at different strengths. And lastly, that we can take spirit from 8 different plates in the second column. And this allows us to take from kind of very light spirit, very fruity, estery, solventy character, all the way down through floral, heavier fruits, down to kind of really oily character at the 8th plate. So the still allows us to target very specific flavours in the single grain, and that really gives us a rich kind of flavour spirit, but lighter in character than a single malt. So it does give you that approachability. And then when it comes to the maturation, we mature in a combination of first and second fill bourbon, and then we finish in new American oak. And again, we introduce something new when it comes to the finishing, in that we're using infrared toasted oak. So we use a combination of 4 different toast levels. 2 of the toast levels are infrared toast, and 2 are traditional toast. That gives us the ability to kind of create a real depth to the sweet character. So we're not just talking about a sugar character or a toffee character. Each toast level brings a range of sweetness from brown sugar, vanilla, chocolate, and by combining the 4, we kind of add a real depth and texture to it.
It's why we chose the name Spearhead. We see ourselves as a spearhead or a pioneer within the Scotch whisky industry. So it was fitting for us to launch a different brand that wasn't under the Loch Lomond distillery label, which meant we could just do things a little bit differently, and we weren't kind of focusing on what the aim or the remit of Loch Lomond whiskies was, but to kind of push the boundaries in its own way under its own brand.
The infrared toasting technology, how long has that been around? And if it's not being used in Scotch whisky so much, has it been deployed in other whisky styles more actively?
It actually comes from the wine industry. Wood has a much greater impact on wine. So when winemakers are choosing wood casks, they need to have tighter control over the flavour. Wine's a kind of lighter character than Scotch whisky, so it picks up the wood character quite quickly. So winemakers need a very tight control over the wood influence that the cask can bring. They're always looking for ways of controlling that, and the infrared toast really came about through that.
And I believe there's some other sort of interesting twists on the production process as well. The yeast that you've used, the fermentation times. Maybe you could talk about some of those aspects of production.
So when we are distilling, we really treat this almost as a single malt up to the point of distillation. The mashing, we take a very slow runoff while we're mashing. So we get a very clear liquid going into the fermenters. And that's important because if you have a cloudy liquid, it coats the surface of the yeast and interferes with yeast growth and stops the yeast producing all the flavours you're looking for them to produce. For the yeast itself, we use a combination of 2 distilling styles of yeast that are higher ester producing, and esters give us fruit character. And then we allow the fermentation to go on for 4 days. Typically, the yeasts will have finished their fermentation between 2 to 3 days and produced all the alcohol and all the flavour that they will. And then that extra day or 2 allows a secondary fermentation by bacteria just present in the distillery environment. And that secondary fermentation again pushes up the ester content of the wash. So that really gives us a very fruit kind of rich wash before we get to distillation. And then just with the way we distill, we're able to get the most flavour out of the wash that we can. We're able to kind of really target the flavour areas that we want to with our still. It's really about creation of flavour and then capturing the flavour by how we distill.
Did you feel like when you were launching this product, there was a bit of a stigma regarding single grain whiskey that you had to overcome?
I think so. I think from a kind of marketing point of view, I think it's really evident and most evident when you go to whiskey festivals, for example. So we did the first whiskey festival here in the UK a couple of weeks ago with Spearhead, called Whiskey Stramash, and I thought it was always going to be interesting to turn up to a whiskey festival where consumers, 99% of the whiskey there is single malt. A lot of it is aged single malt, where people could try, Glen Scotia 25-year-olds, for example, which was, one of the most impressive whiskies there, and one best whiskey in the world. So when you have an opportunity to try that compared to a non-aged statement single grain, it was often hard to compete. But the interesting thing was when people came and tried the whiskey, we managed to convert a lot of people, and that stigma kind of disappeared given the quality of the liquid that we have. So I think that there definitely is a stigma, but as we continue to innovate in that space, I hope over time that'll kind of continue to sort of whittle down and eventually disappear as we start to do more innovative stuff within the space.
Traditionally, Scotch grain whiskey was used only in blending, and in blending, the grain is seen as the lighter flavour component to soften the heavier character of the malt. So I think it comes from that kind of blending history that grain was always seen as the poorer cousin almost of the single malt. And most grains that are in the Scotch market at the minute tend to be that blending style grain that's made from wheat or maize. And they are lighter in character, and they only tend to be released once they're kind of 15, 20 years old. What we're starting to see now in Scotch is that distillers are starting to realise the potential for single grain. There's awareness among whiskey drinkers about mash bills and bourbon, the likes of single pot still Irish. So the flavour potential of grain, people are starting to acknowledge that, and the awareness is coming now. We're seeing Scotch distillers kind of catch on to this. We've been distilling single grain from malted barley for 14 years now. You've the likes of RBK have released a rye whiskey. Inchdarney are looking at rye and oats, and even Johnny Walker have released a blend with rye. So I think the category is starting to gain momentum now.
I think there's kind of an education piece there, or a challenge that we have as well with Spearhead, giving people that understanding that what Spearhead is doing with 100% malted barley and single grain is that the kind of premium end, I guess, for single grain Scotch whiskey, kind of similar to, I guess, Nikka Coffey malt is a good comparison, Japanese whiskey. Then when you look at the opposite end of the scale with lower percentages of malted barley, maybe around about 10%, and the rest kind of wheat or maize, there's that real sort of education piece that we have in that challenge of educating the consumer and sort of showing the premium quality and characteristic of the liquid that we have, which is often a lot easier when you're at a whiskey festival, but then poses that challenge when you don't have liquid in front of people.
Now, Michael, do you want to maybe just quickly sort of give us, some of the, what you see as being the key characters that people are going to experience with Spearhead?
First thing would be when you nose the whiskey, there'd be like floral notes and dark berries, so like black currant, blackberry, and then some sweeter notes of vanilla, caramel, even some dark chocolate. Then when you taste, the first thing you notice is the mouthfeel. There's this really velvety mouthfeel. It just rolls over the tongue. And then you get some like red apple with a nice lime citrus just cuts through the sweetness. Those fruit flavours coming from the malted barley and how we really take that malted barley and mash, ferment and distill it, use the continuous still to capture those fruit notes. That leads us into some vanilla fudge, light brown sugar, but the sweet character has a real depth to it, and that's really from the infrared toast. Gives us the advantage of being able to have an intense heat during the barrel making process to release flavour from the wood, but without any charring or burning of the wood that it could introduce sharper flavours. I feel that's really one of the signatures of Spearhead, is that kind of smoothness with the depth. And then in the finish, you get that long, smooth, sweet finish with melted brown sugar.
And Callum, what are the sort of key consumption occasions that you see Spearhead as being enjoyed in?
Spearhead, as we'd mentioned, is designed to target people who are new to Scotch whisky or younger consumers. We're really trying to tap into that kind of aperitivo movement. So if it's cocktails, it's away from stirred down and brown, your kind of Manhattans, Boulevardiers, old fashions, and it's more into fun, exciting cocktails. So got a number of key serves. We've got a take on a Clover Club. We've also got kind of tapping into that kind of tiki cocktail style movement, a take on a Jungle Bird. And I think there's a really interesting area for Scotch whisky and for sweeter Scotch whiskies in the spritzer style of the menu. So swapping out some of the key, white wine, for example, in a traditional spritzer, putting in whiskey, and then using a liqueur like Pêche de Vigne, which is a peach-based liqueur that kind of brings out those sweeter notes, a little bit of a ginger ale, and it just makes it so much more accessible. And then I think what a lot of Scotch whisky companies do when they bring releases out and try and target that younger demographic is they say it must be made for mixing, or it must be used to mix. And we've also got a key strategy of looking at partnering up with craft beer companies and introducing it as a boilermaker. So picking a craft beer, 25 mils of Spearhead, can of craft beer, and pairing them together, and it just makes it a lot more, accessible and kind of social, I guess.
One thing I would say is that the packaging is quite sort of distinctive and certainly very different to what you would see with most Scotch whiskies. Was that kind of a conscious decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So it takes a lot of that inspiration from a sort of retro Americana theme and tapping into our nod to the casks that we're using. So the bottle is rectangular. We've got embossing on each side. It's very prominent when it sits on a shelf with those kind of high shoulders. On the label, there's a lot of texturing. So we've got a deboss, emboss, and also sort of high screen build on the Spearhead emblem. There's also a Spearhead style punt down the bottom, or a kind of diamond style punt. So when the bottle is put on a back bar, the light kind of hits it, and it really kind of glows and lights up. And even right down to the top of the lip is an apothecary style lip. So when a bartender has it in the well and they pick it up, it's super easy to pour. And even the shippers are a lot slimmer. So that rectangular shape gives us that advantage of being able to pack them smaller, which makes it more environmental. So everything's been thought through, from, the style of the lip through to that kind of retro Americana feel that taps into those casks that we use.
Fantastic. If people want to follow you guys on social media, where can they find you?
So we're on Instagram, Facebook, and also Twitter. So it's just at Spearhead Whisky, and you'll find us there.
Good stuff. Well, Callum and Michael, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me this morning in Scotland, and look forward to seeing how this really exciting project evolves.
I'd say thanks for having us in.
Thanks a lot for having us, James.
Spearhead Whisky is out now at First Choice Liquor, Liquorland and Vintage Cellars stores across Australia, priced very competitively at $62 for a 700ml bottle. And if you look carefully, you might even do better than that. I've seen it on promotion for $55 in recent weeks. The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.